Today we're going to be reviewing Volume 1 of Clive Barker's Books of Blood, and just so we're all on the same page, Clive Barker is not for the faint of heart. He is a gory, suspenseful writer who laces in a lot of sexuality. That's probably the best way to describe his work on the whole, is sort of a sensual gore sort of thing. And if that is not for you, go ahead and skip this video. I will do plenty others of classic horror later on in the month. The Books of Blood are a collection of short stories, and they are framed by basically saying, this is how we found out this information. So it's done to sort of draw the reader in. So the first story in Volume 1 of the Books of Blood is The Book of Blood. And it's about this paranormal researcher. She works for a university, and her husband has died. And so she's gotten interested in the paranormal and in contacting the other side because she misses her husband. She loves her husband and she misses her husband. And she finds this young man who claims to be able to speak to the dead. So they go to this house that is described as a crossroads of highways for the dead. So it's very active in paranormal terms. And this young man, if you leave him alone in the attic, claims to have been able to speak to all these ghosts. And he writes these stories on the walls, seemingly out of nothing. He's actually a charlatan, and he's hidden a bit of graphite under his tongue. Not a spoiler, that's told to us very early on. So he's writing these stories on the walls and claiming that it is the dead stories, or the stories of the dead. So the stories of how all these people died. And, he's trying to scam them, so he's looking up names in phone books and obituaries and things like that. And, of course, the paranormal researcher wants to believe, so she eats it up. The problem is, the house really is a crossroads of highways for the dead, and the dead don't like the fact that he's lying about them, and they get really upset. And so they sort of break through the barrier and carve into his skin their stories, their real stories. And that is what the Books of Blood are. They are the stories written by the dead on this man's skin as vengeance for making light of their situation. One of the things that I found to be unique in this collection of short stories is the authorial voice and how it shifted depending on what story he was telling. So some of the books are funny. They're still horror stories, but they're kind of funny and silly. And some of them are very pragmatic and very serious. And some of them are just straight up like eldritch horror. And they all feel a little bit different. And I think that was really neat. And it worked better, in some places than others. So the first Book of Blood that we're reading off of this kid's skin is The Midnight Meat Train. There are two character perspectives in Midnight Meat Train. One is an accountant who is new to the city and has been there just long enough for the shine to wear off. And the other is a holy man, but would probably more appropriately be called a butcher. The story takes place in New York City, and as is typical of New York, there's a killer on the loose. People are being found hanging upside down, stripped of their clothing and their belongings, and shaved and bled dry, hanging in subway cars. We learn, of course, that this is the holy man, or the butcher, working on orders from whatever god or gods he thinks is telling him to go and kill these people. And as you would expect, there is a meeting of the accountant and the butcher, and the danger and the suspense of that sort of confrontation in that situation is very well written. When you are reading the fear that the accountant is experiencing, when he realizes what is happening around him, when he realizes he's next, it's palpable. It's really well done. It's very engaging. And up until that point, the story is fantastic. It's written in this really interesting sort of head-hopping style where you're bouncing between the accountant and the butcher. And in a longer book, that wouldn't work. In a longer book, that would be exhausting. But in the short, condensed version of a story that we get, it works really well. So you're sort of bouncing between the two characters' perspectives without any real indication that you've swapped heads. And that just gets faster and faster as the story progresses. And as you race towards the climax, each individual section gets shorter and shorter. And it works really well as a way of building suspense. Again, I wouldn't want it in a full-length novel. It would be exhausting to try and keep up with that. But in a short story, it was really well executed. It worked really well. After that, we sort of slip into Lovecraftian horror. And it has this sort of open-ended, not very well explained and not grounded in the previous information that was laid way of presenting information that, in my opinion, didn't work particularly well. Lovecraftian horror, to me, works best, Eldritch horror works best, when it is subtle and far away. The further away it is, the scarier it is. When it's like right in front of you and everything is described, it doesn't do a great job. And that's just a personal taste for me. I think Eldritch horror does better at a distance, and this Midnight Meat Train gets really right up close and personal. And for me, it didn't work. But if you're really into like Lovecraftian horror and the ancient ones and that sort of concept, and you really like that, you'll probably really like this story. The Yattering and Jack is about a man whose soul is under siege by a demon, and who is somehow entirely unaware of this fact, which of course drives the demon crazy. The demon pulls all kinds of torments on Jack. He kills his cat multiple times. He keeps getting a new cat, and the demon keeps killing his cats. He destroys his dishes. He, tears apart his pillow just as Jack is trying to sleep on it. And all the while, this character Jack just sort of shrugs and goes about his life. He's completely unfazed. And it's just every torment that the demon visits upon him, Jack ignores or brushes off as bad luck or, que sera, sera, the world will go on. And it's just sort of, it's so incredibly British. It is so British. The main character, Jack Polo, is a caricature of the British stiff upper lip. And this drives the demon wild. The demon cannot gain any purchase. He's meant to drive this man mad, and he's failing because the guy is just like, life goes on, And it's this delightful mix of horror and comedy, and it's all sort of twisty, and there are shocking bits, but it's not grotesque, and I just really liked it. In Volume 1, it is easily my favorite of the short stories in Volume 1. So the story explores kind of how far we're willing to go, and how much we're willing to tolerate, and how far and hard we're willing to push in order to win. And I think that that's really a cool concept to explore in a short story. Pig Blood Blues is about an ex-cop with a proclivity for little boys who takes a job teaching woodshop at a reform school for juvenile delinquents, specifically young male juvenile delinquents. One of the boys is missing, and everybody on staff says that the boy just ran away, even though there's no reasonable way out of the institution, and his friend, who is still there, is very convinced that the boy is still in the institution. And we find out that the boy believes that his friend is dead and that it's his ghost that is in the institution. The story elements are cults and cultists and ritual sacrifice, and it's got some pretty scathing social commentary in there. I think the take on the cop, specifically on his friendship with this boy, I don't think you could get away with that in 2022. I think it works for the story, but he's made out sort of as the hero, or at least he believes he's the hero. He's made out sort of as this non-villainous man, and I don't think that you could be that subtle with it in 2022. So it was really interesting, reading in the modern era, to read this story that was written in the early 80s. I have to be careful with the way that I talk about it because of monetization, right? But it was really interesting to read something on that particular subject matter that was done so subtly. don't worry, it all works out in the end, but you don't know that until the very end. And it was just a really interesting read. It made me uncomfortable, but it was supposed to. That was the point of it. So I think the story itself did a good job. I enjoyed the story. I don't normally like the particular type of horror that's in this story, but in a short story format, it worked fine, and I enjoyed it. Sex, Death and Starshine is about a crumbling old theater sort of on its last legs, and they're putting on a production of Twelfth Night, starring a soap opera starlet who's very famous but can't actually act. The director discovers that this performance of Twelfth Night will be the theater's last performance. Once they're finished, the doors will close, the theater will close, and it will be demolished. And so their rehearsals are going terribly because their leading lady can't act. And it's just sort of this sad tribute to this great establishment, and they're not doing it justice. And they know they're not doing it justice. So the rehearsals are visited by this sort of theater patron, this man of the arts, this older man who has loved the theater for a long time. And we sort of get the impression that he's been around for longer than he leads on or lets on. And the patron doesn't like that this grand theater, that its reputation and that its final act will be sullied by the terrible acting of this soap opera starlet. So he sort of leverages to supplant her with his own star, who happens to be his dead wife. The story itself is very Halloween. It's a great little read for the spooky season. You know, it's the kind of thing that you could, I would say, curl up and read to children, but you shouldn't read this to children. It has Clive Barker's sort of, sex and blood thing going on. He always seems to find a way to insert that in every story he's written, at least every story I've read that he's written. That's just kind of his thing. So it's not for children, but it reads very much like an adult version of a Goosebumps story sort of thing. It's predictable, but not in a bad way. You know what's going to happen, but you still enjoy getting there, if that makes sense. So it's a ghost story, and it's perfectly suited for Halloween. In the Hills, the Cities is about two small rural villages in the hill country of Yugoslavia. And every 10 years, these twin cities, these neighboring cities, get together and they have this battle, this contest, where each city constructs a giant made of men. So all of the city's population sort of gets together and they, tie themselves with ropes and levers and pulleys and this construction frame, and they make these giant men that sort of wade out into the hills, and then they do battle, right? They've been doing this for hundreds of years. It is a tradition of their people, and it is a secret of the hill people. Anybody outside of that area doesn't know that this happens. The problem is, in one of the towns, the woman who used to design their models died. She died the previous year, and her daughter has taken over. Her daughter doesn't have as much experience. This woman had been doing this for 60 years. She knew what she was doing. And the construction on one of the giants is botched. There's an error. There's something wrong with the way that it's built. And so instead of doing battle, the thing just sort of topples over. The problem is, it's the size of a multi-story building, and it is made entirely of people. There's 30,000 people in this thing. So as they fall, all of the citizens within this giant construction are crushed to death, or spattered on the ground, basically. And it causes this tidal wave of blood to sort of wash through the valleys in between these hills. And the only witness to the death and destruction are these two British tourists who themselves are having, a difficult time of it. And it's an interesting mix of wonder and horror, and it's a very sober story. I think the contrast between something like The Yattering and Jack, which was, comic-laced horror, and In the Hills, the Cities, which is very sober and very serious and very sort of awestruck. I just think that it's neat that both of these short stories are contained within the same volume or same collection of work. So if I had to rank Volume 1's short stories in order from my favorite to my least favorite, number 1 is easily The Yattering and Jack. I liked the sort of break-in writing style where he'll be in the middle of a sentence and then there's just a parentheses and some other completely unrelated thought or side thought or tangent. It was like reading somebody's own personal internal narrative, but in a good way. It wasn't clustered or confused. It was precise and intentional, and it really added to the story. It helped you sort of feel the chaos that was inside the demon. I loved the portrayal of Jack Polo. I thought that his sort of caricature of the, gherkin importer from Britain, the stiff upper lip British man, was beautiful. I thought it was perfectly done. I really, really enjoyed The Yattering and Jack. Second would be In the Hills, the Cities. I loved the imagination behind it. I loved the way that he sort of slowly unraveled and slowly gave you a picture of what was happening. He didn't just come out and say like, oh, they're making these giant constructions out of people. Like, it was a slow, like I said, a slow unravel, and you had to kind of figure out what was going on, and he just kind of fed you little tiny bits of information until you finally grasped the concept and were like, oh, this is what's going on. This is the contest. This is the battle. And I thought that was really well done, especially in a short story format. Third would be The Book of Blood, and it's third because of the imagination behind it, which I thought was really interesting, that it's sort of the frame within which all of these other short stories are being told. I'm not generally a big fan of the whole, like, crossing over to the other side stories. I tend to prefer subtle horror. I tend to prefer more suspense horror than direct, like, oh, hey, there's a monster. Clive Barker does more monster horror, does more direct horror, does more in-your-face sort of horror, which is fine. And, sometimes I like a taste of that. But this, because that is where my tastes trend, I didn't love the story, even though I loved the concept. Fourth would be Sex, Death and Starshine. And the reason it's wound up fourth is because of its predictability. Like I said, it feels like a Goosebumps story for adults, which is not bad. But it has its time and place, right? It's not something I'd want to read all the time. And like I mentioned during the review of that section, it's very predictable. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but when I know what's going to happen from start to end, it kind of detracts a little bit from the enjoyment sometimes. So this was predictable, not necessarily in a bad way, but its predictability did drop it in the rankings for me a bit. And my least favorite among Volume 1 was Midnight Meat Train. I thought that the build-up for it was fantastic. If they had cut it off with the doors sliding open and the man is just in shock, in horror, and that had been the end of it, it would have been a better story, in my opinion. Like I said, I don't really like in-your-face eldritch horror. I think eldritch horror is done better at a distance. It is more horrifying when it is unknown. And the second you start actually confronting it face to face, it loses some of its shine. And that's probably just because it's 2022, it's not new, it's been done, we've seen it on screen so many times at this point, whereas when this book was written in the early 80s, if it had been seen on screen, it wasn't done very well. So I think eldritch horror has lost some of its horror aspect, and it's more just, okay, there's these old gods, out in the ether and nobody can really see them, and if you do, you go crazy. And it's, it's lost something, and therefore it works better from further away. And because this was so in your face with it, it just didn't do it for me. I liked the build up though. I really enjoyed the story up until the point that the door slid open and he was confronted with what was really going on. So my overall impressions of Clive Barker's Books of Blood, at least Volume 1 so far. It's a fun little read. It's perfectly suited for Halloween. Don't take it too seriously, and don't be too sensitive about everything. You can't read Clive Barker and be precious about bodily autonomy and things like that. it's meant to be shocking, and it is. So the stories in the Books of Blood have a sort of universal predictability to them. They're not all as predictable as Starshine, but you do kind of know what's going to happen going through them. And the reason for that is because they are foundational. Clive Barker has written stories that have been mimicked and copied and extrapolated and built upon for decades, for 40 years now. So if you think of horror classics like Candyman, like Hellraiser, those are Clive Barker stories. In fact, I believe they come from the Books of Blood in later volumes. So the fact that you can kind of see it coming just means that you know his writing style and you understand kind of how he constructs horror stories. And the reason you know his writing style, the reason you can see the way he constructs horror stories is because they're so familiar. And the reason they're so familiar is because they're so well known, they're so popular. Even if it's not his story you're consuming, it's someone who is inspired by him. And that's a hell of a testament to a writer. That's a hell of a thing. So yes, the stories are somewhat predictable. And I have the same experience, when I'm reading Lovecraft, that it's like, oh, I knew that was going to happen from the beginning. This is exactly the way that I expected. But the reason it's predictable is because it's foundational. The reason it's predictable and the reason you know what's going to happen is because it is the first of its kind, or one of the first of its kind. And every one after that, every writer after that who writes in this style is standing on Clive Barker's shoulders. So for that reason and that reason alone, it is an enjoyable read to me. Even if, I could pick apart the stories and go, oh, I'm not really a fan of that. Oh, this was too predictable for me. I can still genuinely appreciate the mind behind the writing and the fact that it is the first of its kind or near the first of its kind and how unique it was in its time. I think when you're reading older stories, in particular pop fiction sort of stories, like horror stories or like mystery novels or, whodunit sort of things, you have to kind of understand that everything after that, writing is kind of like building a building. You stand on what was laid before. And Clive Barker was one of the people who sort of laid the groundwork for modern horror. And I think that in and of itself is something to celebrate. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and of course if you like the way that I present information, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell down below. You can find all of my social media contacts in the description, and of course if you want to keep up with me and the progress I'm making on my current novel, you can do that at effywritesbooks.com. Thank you so much for watching, have an excellent day, and I'll see you next time.